Nobody talks about the waiting rooms at Buckingham Palace. Not the grand ones, not the gilded anterooms where ambassadors sit on chairs that cost more than a car. I mean the other ones, the narrow side corridors with the ticking clock and the faint smell of old carpet and the particular silence that belongs only to places where important people have decided to make someone else feel small. I know about those rooms because my cousin Philippa sat in one for 47 minutes. She counted. Let me back up. This was late autumn. The kind of London morning where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain or just threaten to. That dirty pewter light pressing down on everything, tourists still milling around the Victoria Memorial with their cameras up, their breath coming out in little clouds. You could hear the horses from the household cavalry somewhere distant, that clip-end jingle that sounds like a film score playing behind real life. Philippa had flown in from Cape Town. 14 hours, middle seat. She is Camilla's second cousin, once removed, technically, if you care about that kind of architecture. The Parker Bowl side, and old family, good manners, the kind of people who send handwritten thank you notes and genuinely mean them. She'd been invited, or believed she had been invited, to a small private reception at the palace following Charles's birthday observance. Not the public ceremony. The private one. Family. She had the original correspondence. Printed, and in a folder. With tabs. Plus, Philippa is that kind of person. The problem started 3 weeks before she boarded that plane. A second letter arrived, this one not on the warm cream stationery she'd received before, but something crisper, more official looking. More deliberate, the way a door closing slowly is still a door closing. It came from a private secretary's office. It thanked her, in 4 beautifully constructed paragraphs, for her anticipated attendance. And, then, for what it's worth, it uninvited her. Not in those words. Plus, actually, of course not in those words. It spoke of revised arrangements and intimate family considerations and sincere hope for future occasions. It was, objectively, a masterpiece of English indirection, the kind of letter that takes more skill to write than a direct refusal, because it's to deliver the blow while appearing to offer a cushion. Philippa read it twice. She honestly put it down on her kitchen table in Cape Town, in the morning light coming off the mountain, and she sat very still. Then, she called her mother. Her mother said, honestly, don't you dare let them do this without an explanation. Her mother is 81 and has opinions the size of Table Mountain. Here is what nobody outside the family understood at the time, and what would later leave people inside the palace genuinely unsettled. Philippa wasn't alone. There were 4 of them. Plus, 4 relatives on Camilla's side, not close, not claiming any throne, not seeking cameras or commentary. Ordinary people connected by blood to the woman who had become queen consort. They had each received the initial invitation. They had each booked travel, which one had taken unpaid leave from work. One had bought a new dress. And they had each, within the same 2-week window, received versions of that same careful, killing letter. The revised arrangements, which the intimate family considerations. The sincere hope for future occasions that everyone involved understood to mean, not this one, and possibly not any. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that the decision hadn't come from Camilla. That's the part that matters. That's the part that, when it eventually surfaced in those narrow corridor conversations that move through royal households like weather, left people choosing their words more carefully than usual. Even the ones who'd been around long enough to think nothing surprised them anymore. The letters had been coordinated tactfully, efficiently, the way only institutions with centuries of practice at quiet exclusion can manage, through channels that didn't pass across Camilla's desk. She found out the same way her relatives did. Almost, which Philippa landed at Heathrow anyway. I want you to understand this about her, she isn't dramatic. Basically, she doesn't make scenes. She was not coming to storm a gate or manufacture a confrontation for anyone's benefit. She came because she had already booked the ticket before the second letter arrived, and because her mother told her to look the thing in the face, and because, and this is the part one keep thinking about, she genuinely believed there had been some kind of mistake. She believed that because she knew Camilla. Not intimately. Not the way you know someone you see every week. But the way family knows family, through summers, through weddings, through the particular knowledge of how someone laughs when they think no one important is watching. She knew that Camilla had in particular mentioned looking forward to seeing them. She had said it in the first letter, in a handwritten postscript. Philippa had kept basically that letter to different folder. No tabs, just the letter, on its own, like it meant something. Because it had. She checked into a hotel in Pimlico, modest, clean, the kind of place with a decent breakfast and a night staff who minded their own business. She unpacked her new dress, she hung it on the back of the bathroom door and looked at it for a while. Then, she sat on the edge of the bed and wrote a note. Not a letter. Plus, not a formal request through proper channels. A note the kind a person writes to another person when they're not interested in institutions, just in the truth. In my opinion, short, direct. The way her mother raised her to be when it actually mattered. She addressed it to Camilla. She gave it to the hotel concierge with instructions for hand delivery. The concierge looked at the address, looked at Philippa, and said nothing. Just took it. Tucked it into his jacket pocket like it was the most ordinary thing. Maybe, well, to him, it was. And then she waited. That was a Thursday. By Friday morning, nothing, which by Friday afternoon, she'd walked to St. James's Park because she needed the cold air and the ducks and something that wasn't the four walls of a hotel room in Pimlico. She sat on a bench near the water. A child nearby was throwing bread at a swan with the dedicated fury of someone completing an important mission. The swan was winning. Philippa watched them, and she thought about the dress on the back of the bathroom door. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone, don't let them. She thought about look, the postscript in the first letter. Pretty much, the handwriting. Friday evening, her phone rang. Plus, unknown number. London area code. She answered it on the second ring. She would tell me later she'd almost let it go to voicemail, almost, because she'd been half convinced it was the hotel asking about checkout and the voice on the other end was not what she expected. It was not official. It was not a secretary or an aide or anyone performing the particular brand of professional warmth that institutions deploy when they want to sound human without being accountable. It was a woman's voice. Tired. A little raw, actually, the way voices get when someone has been having a day that ground on them. Philippa said she knew the voice before the name. It's me, the voice said. Like, I'm so sorry. I only just in my opinion, found out. The 5 words that would, in their own quiet way, bring the thing no one at the palace had anticipated. Not a confrontation. Not a scandal. Something harder pretty much, to manage than either. The look, truth, spoken by the wrong person at the wrong time, moving through the right channels for the very first time. When an institution has existed for 1,000 years, it develops certain reflexes. Not thoughts, reflexes. The way a hand pulls back from a flame before the brain has even processed the heat, that's how a royal household handles disruption. Fast, quiet. The for what it's worth, whole mechanism activates before anyone has formally decided it should. Kind of, papers get shuffled. Schedules get quietly restructured, the right people start appearing in the right corridors at the right time, and nobody has to explain why because everyone already understands the unspoken grammar of it. What the palace didn't have a reflex for was Camilla picking up the phone herself. A member of staff, I won't name her, she's still employed there and deserves to keep her job, described the following 2 days to someone I trust. Not as a leak, which not as gossip engineered for anyone's consumption. She described it the way people describe things that genuinely unsettle them, carefully, quietly, like she was still working out what it meant. She said, the temperature changed. That's the only way I can describe it. The temperature in basically, certain rooms just changed. What Camilla had said on that call, in the hotel room in Pimlico, was not inflammatory. She hadn't raged, she hadn't issued ultimatums. She had apologized. And then, she to be fair, had asked Philippa to give her 48 hours. Philippa said yes. What else do you say? After she hung up, she sat on the bed for a long time. The dress was still on the bathroom door. She didn't look at it. She looked at the window, at the grey London sky going darker, the lights of Pimlico coming up orange against the dusk, a bus going past with its windows lit and warm and full of ordinary Friday evening people going nowhere in particular. She thought she didn't know. That thought actually did something strange to her. Something she hadn't been prepared for, and she'd spent 2 weeks building a tidy architecture of quiet resentment, the kind that keeps you functional, keeps you moving, gives you something solid to push against. And now someone had removed the load-bearing wall. She ordered room service. She watched television, and she didn't know, sitting there in Pimlico with a club sandwich, that by morning 3 different people inside the palace would be having conversations they'd been carefully not having for years. The 48 hours started on a Friday. By Saturday morning, someone had briefed someone who briefed someone else, and the information moving through those back channels had picked up a particular charge, the specific voltage that runs through an institution when it realizes a private matter is threatening to become a human one. I mean, those are different problems. Institutional problems have protocols. Human ones don't. The original decision to revise the invitations hadn't been capricious. That's what I want to be clear about, because it's easy to construct a villain in these situations and the reality is more uncomfortable than a villain. It had been a considered choice made by people whose job it was to manage access, manage optics, manage the 10,000 invisible calculations that go into presenting a monarchy to a watching world. Charles had been on the throne less than 2 years. Every gathering was still being calibrated. Every face in every room was still being weighed. Camilla's relatives, for what it's worth, warm, well-meaning, holding their printed correspondence in their tabbed folders, had been weighed. And then, they'd been quietly set aside. Not because anyone disliked them. Because someone had decided that the optics of extended Parker Bowles family presence at a private birthday gathering, in a media environment that was still periodically raking over old ground, was a complication that could be avoided. It was, in the language of risk management, a preventive measure. It was, in the language of actual human beings, an ambush. Camilla found out, and this is the detail that, when I heard it, sat in my chest with a particular weight because one of the relatives had written to her separately. Not Philippa. One of the others. An older cousin, a woman in her late 60s, who'd received the disinvitation letter and hadn't called anyone, hadn't flown to London, had simply written a short, quiet note asking if she'd done something to cause offense. Had she done something wrong? That, I guess, note had reached Camilla on a Thursday morning. She'd read it at her desk. And then, according to the member of staff who described the temperature changing, she had stood up, walked out of the room, and asked to speak with the relevant private secretary. For what it's worth, no raised voices. No scene. Just, I need to understand what happened here. The 48 hours were not quiet ones for anyone. Except Philippa, who was doing an admirable impression of a person who hadn't thing writing on any of this. She walked around London. She went to the National Portrait Gallery and stood in front of a painting of a woman she couldn't identify for longer than the painting probably warranted. She had lunch in a pub in Covent Garden and accidentally ordered something she didn't want but ate it anyway because she couldn't face the interaction of sending it back. She would tell me later, absolutely terrified. Not of being turned away. She'd already been turned away once. She'd survived the tabbed folder and the middle seat and all of it. She was terrified of hope. Of having been called by that voice, that tired raw voice saying I only just found out, and having it mean nothing in the end. Of going home to Cape Town with the dress cleaned and repacked and a story she'd tell carefully around the edges for years. Sunday came. No call, and Sunday evening. She ordered room service again. Different club sandwich, same television. Actually, Monday morning. She was sitting, I guess, with her coffee looking at her phone when it rang. Different look, number this time, which a man's voice. Formal. But not, she noticed this, performing warmth. Just direct. Precise, like someone who'd been asked to make this call and was going to make it properly. He gave his name. His title. She recognized the title. He said that Her Majesty wished to extend an invitation to Philippa and the other relatives for a private lunch. Not the original event that had passed. Honestly, something separate. Something arranged specifically. He gave her a date. He gave her an address, not the one she'd been expecting. He asked if she was available, which she said yes. Then, she called her mother. Her mother listened to the whole thing in silence, which isn't her mother's default mode. When Philippa finished, there was a pause, the kind that means someone is choosing between several available responses. Her mother said, "What are you going to wear?" There are 22 people who work in various capacities near enough to Camilla's offices to have understood, in the days following that Monday call, what had happened and what it meant. Most of them will never discuss it openly. Several of them had been involved, at various distances, in the original decision to revise the invitations. None of them, I imagine, had anticipated that the revision would be reversed not through a press briefing or a managed narrative, but through a personal phone call made on a Friday evening to a hotel room in Pimlico. The institution had done what institutions do. And, then, the person at the center of it had done what persons do. Those aren't always the same thing. Usually, for what it's worth, in a royal household, the institution wins that particular conflict without the conflict ever becoming visible. This time it didn't. Not because of politics. Not because of any external pressure or media inquiry. Because one elderly woman in her late 60s had sat down and written a note by hand asking, with genuine bewilderment, if she had done something wrong. The member of staff, the one who described the temperature changing, said something else when she told this story. She said that after Camilla had the conversation with the private secretary, after the quiet mechanics of the reversal had been set in motion, she had walked back to her desk and stood at the window for a while. Just stood there. Looking out at whatever a window in that building looks out onto. And, she had said, not to anyone in particular, not loudly, their family. 2 words. The private secretary, to his credit, hadn't offered a response. Some things aren't institutional problems. Some things actually are just the truth, standing in a room, waiting to see if anyone has the nerve to let it stay. The address wasn't Buckingham Palace. That was the first surprise. Philippa had prepared herself, the tabs, the folder, the dress, the particular internal posture you develop when you're walking into a building that has been making people feel small since before your country existed as a country. She'd rehearsed nothing, specifically, but she'd spent enough time in the preceding days quietly pre-managing her own expectations. That she'd constructed a fairly detailed mental architecture of what the experience would feel like. It didn't look like any of that. It was in my opinion, private residence. A room with actual chairs, not chairs that were making a point about themselves, just chairs, and books on shelves that had clearly been read rather than staged, and a dog, which nobody had mentioned. A medium-sized dog of uncertain breed who approached Philippa with the specific confidence of an animal that has never been told it might not be welcome somewhere. The dog put its nose on her knee. She thought, all right then, the 4 relatives hadn't all met before. That's the thing people don't account for when they think about extended families. They imagine everyone circled around a table together at Christmas, cheeks flushed, knowing all the same stories. The reality of scattered family is that you can share blood and a surname footnote and almost nothing else. Philippa knew one of the others from a wedding, years back. The older cousin, the one who had written the note, the woman whose quietly devastating question had started the whole mechanism turning, she'd never met at all. Her name was Margaret. She was 68, which she wore a green coat and carried a bag that looked like it had been resold twice. She, for what it's worth, shook Philippa's hand with both of hers. Philippa recognized her immediately. Not from photographs, and from something in the face, the particular set of the jaw, the way she assessed a room without appearing to assess it. That Parker Bowles quality, her mother would have called it. Like they've all read the same chapter on dignity and none of them will admit the chapter exists. They waited in the room with the dog and the actual books for about 12 minutes. Not the 47 minutes of the first waiting room. Not the pretty much narrow corridor and the ticking clock. 12 minutes, which is the length of time it takes to establish that you're being hosted rather than processed. When Camilla came in, she was wearing what Philippa described to me as just clothes. Not a statement. Not an occasion. Clothes that someone wears when they're trying to communicate, through fabric, that today is about people and, not positions. She, for what it's worth, came straight to Margaret first. Not to Philippa, who she'd spoken to on the phone, who she knew was the one who'd traveled, who could have been reasonably prioritized as the diplomatic opening. I mean, she went to Margaret. The woman who'd written the note, who'd asked, with that heartbreaking simplicity, if she had done something wrong. She took both of Margaret's hands. She said if Philippa was close enough to hear it, you did absolutely nothing wrong. I want you to hear that first. Margaret said nothing. Her eyes, though. There's a particular quality to watching someone be genuinely apologized to for something that was genuinely not their fault. It's different from reconciliation scenes in films, which are calibrated for catharsis, the swelling, the embrace, the visible release. Real apology between real people is quieter and more complicated and somehow more devastating for it. Margaret nodded once. She said, I just needed to know. And that was, largely, that. Not because it was simple. Because Margaret is the kind of person who doesn't need an apology to come with an explanation attached. She'd asked one question. She'd gotten the answer. I guess, the rest was furniture. Plus, lunch was not formal. I keep wanting to say it differently, keep reaching for a better word than not formal, but Philippa's account of it doesn't give me better words. She said, it was just lunch. She said it like that was the most remarkable thing about the day, and I think she meant it. There were 4 relatives and Camilla and one other person not identified, not a subject of the story, just present, and a table with food on it and wine for those who wanted it and tea for those who didn't. The dog was still there. The dog eventually positioned itself under the table near someone's feet with the permanent optimism of its kind. They talked. About South Africa, someone asked Philippa about Cape Town, about what it was actually like now, not the what it's like of diplomatic visits but the actual texture of a life there. She talked for longer than she expected to. The others talked about their lives, ordinary lives, working lives, the kinds of lives that don't appear in court circulars. Camilla, Philippa told me, mostly listened, and there's a specific skill in that, in listening as a person rather than listening as a role. It requires a particular kind of setting down. Philippa had spent enough time around people who occupied public positions to know the difference between being listened to and being heard while someone waits for their next contribution. This wasn't that. At some point, and I'm placing this here carefully because timing matters, Camilla mentioned, not as a declaration but just as a thing she said in the middle of a sentence, that she'd had to do a fair bit of reading in the last few weeks about how things were arranged. Honestly, how decisions were made. What moved through which channels and what didn't. She didn't elaborate. She moved on. The others understood, which what shifted in the weeks after, and this is the part that the member of staff described as leaving the palace in a condition she could only call recalibrated, was not visible from the outside. There was no announcement. No briefing. No careful message management about lessons learned, which the machinery of the institution went on looking exactly as it always had. But certain conversations honestly started happening differently, not because of a directive. Because word basically travels in close quarters, and when word travels about something that touches on who gets to be considered family and who gets quietly redirected by someone who doesn't actually have the authority to make that call, that word carries weight. It finds its level, which it sits in rooms and changes the temperature. 3 people who had been involved in the original invitation revision, at various levels and with varying degrees of direct responsibility, were asked, not pressured, just asked, to review the criteria by which private family attendance decisions were made. Not as punishment. As a process question. The process question is, in institutional language, a form of consequence that leaves everyone's dignity technically intact. Philippa flew honestly home on a Thursday. Different seat this time, she'd asked to check in, on a whim, if there was anything available in the exit row. There was. She sat in it with her legs stretched out and her bag at her feet and watched England going grey and small beneath the clouds. She had the folder with the tabs in her carry-on. She had the dress, dry-cleaned, repacked. She had the first letter, the warm one, the invitation still in its separate pocket. Still with the handwritten postscript. Plus, she didn't have a good story for people who would ask how the trip went, because the true story was too interior, too dependent on tone and temperature and the particular quality of 12 minutes in a room with an actual dog, and those things don't translate well into the version you tell at dinner parties. She told people it had been fine. That things had been sorted out. They pressed, because people do, which she said. It turns out it was a misunderstanding. Which was true. In the way that all the worst things that happen between people are misunderstandings, if you're willing to look at them long enough. Margaret called Philippa when she'd landed. She said, "How was the flight?" Philippa said it was long, but she'd had the exit row. Margaret said, "Good. You deserved a little room." I've thought about what made the whole thing so unsettling to the people who witnessed it from the inside, why it registered, in the words of the person I heard it from, as a shock rather than just a correction. I think it's actually this: institutions run on the assumption that their decisions, once made, will hold. Not because they're right and wrong aren't institutional categories, not really. Because the weight of the thing, the accumulated seriousness of it, will make individual people shrink. Doubt themselves. Accept the revised arrangements. Fold the dress back into the suitcase and go home and feel vaguely embarrassed about ever having believed the first letter. What they hadn't accounted for was a 68-year-old woman with a resold bag who didn't want justice or attention or even an explanation. Who just needed to know. That's the thing, look, that moves through walls when nothing else can. Not anger. Basically, not ambition. Not performance. Just a person, sitting down with paper and a pen, asking an honest question. Someone at the other end of a long chain having the conscience to take it seriously. The dog, Philippa told me, was named something she couldn't pronounce correctly. She'd tried twice. Everyone had laughed. Even her. And that, in its own small way, was the whole story.